Our water. Civilization rests upon it, yet we live in a world where we hardly think about it. For most Americans, pouring a drink of water is as easy as turning on the faucet. We expect our water to be clean, and for the most part it is. But that perception changed with recent events.
It's not safe to drink the water in Flint, Michigan.
Flint, Michigan is in a state of emergency.
Growing anger over tainted, lead-poisoned water.
Flint, Michigan has brought water into the forefront in the American psyche.
Farming communities are familiar with battles over water quality. Corn and soybean fields may not contribute to lead in the water, but farms do rely on a host of chemicals to keep crops green and growing. As water moves from its source to its final destination, it passes cities and millions of farm acres, and changes from pristine to polluted. No one wants to find dangerous chemicals in their drinking glass, and everyone is trying to keep it clean.
I don't think there's any farmer that wakes up in the morning and says, I'm just gonna go dump 1,000 gallons of fertilizer down the ditch. Everybody's trying.
We're now thinking about, is my water safe?
Our story of water quality and agriculture begins high above the region known as the Mississippi Watershed Basin, a system of creeks and rivers, like the Platte, that drain into the Mississippi River. It's like a giant bathtub that covers the middle of our nation. And to figure out what's in the bathtub besides water, you need to look at where it all drains, the Gulf of Mexico. When scientists look at the water in the Gulf, they find an overload of two chemicals, nitrogen and phosphorus. These chemicals grow huge plumes of algae that suck oxygen from the water and block sunlight, causing a hypoxic zone, an area that won't support any fish or wildlife. This area is called the dead zone, and it's estimated to cost the seafood and tourism industries $82 million every year. And despite federal and state task forces, the dead zone is as large as ever, over 5,000 square miles in recent years, and well over the targeted size first set by the EPA in 2001. So what's happening? Let's take a look at water inside the Mississippi River Basin, from a small farm community engineering its way to clean groundwater.
How's it going?
To researchers studying fish exposed to toxins in rivers. Then we'll see how farmers are using high-tech and low-tech solutions to keep water clean. But first, let's back all the way up to the Rocky Mountains, where much of this water comes from, and see who is watching our water as it travels through Denver and its sprawling suburbs to rural farmlands in the east.
I grew up in a small town about an hour away from where the Platte River empties into the Missouri.
Chris Ray and his coworker are in the mountains above Denver, testing the water quality of the South Platte River. It's a river near and dear to Chris's heart.
It's something that's always in the back of my mind when I'm up here monitoring.
Here at 8,700 feet, the Platte is a stream, just a hike away from where it started as snow.
And so it's really interesting to me, especially to be in the very high parts of the watershed where I can step across the Platte versus where I grew up, where the bridge is 1/4 mile long.
The river has been the lifeline of development for Metro Denver and ranches and farms in the east. From its origins in Colorado, the Platte will flow north into Wyoming before it heads east into Nebraska. Here in the mountains, the water looks clear enough to drink, and today you probably could.
The pH of this site is a 7.05. People might recognize that as what people think is neutral pH. It's pure pristine because we're above those kind of impacts, human impacts or even environmental impacts. And that's why we in Denver are so lucky to have this source that we do. We are largely the first users of this water.
From the mountain peaks to the western edge of Denver, some 60 miles as the crow flies, the South Platte arrives at one of 3 potable water treatment plants. Even though the water is relatively clean, it still must be filtered and disinfected. Then it's sent out to consumers. But Denver Water continues to closely monitor it. Denver Water is used by nearly 1.5 million people. But Steve Rogowski of the Metro Wastewater Reclamation Facility knows there are countless people to the east who are depending on clean water flowing in the Platte River.
Even though we're close to the source, we're very much in tune with this cycle of the river where water is used and reused and put back in the river and reused again. Producing clean water that makes up a great portion of the flows in the South Platte River so that it can be used downstream for aquatic life, for water supplies, for agricultural purposes. That is the mission of our district.
Testing the cleanliness of the water as it leaves this plant and many wastewater plants around the U.S. is one of the tasks of the National Water Quality Assessment Program. It's run by the U.S. Geological Survey from the Denver Federal Center.
The USGS has long-term monitoring in about 100 rivers nationwide that we've been monitoring since the early 90s and in some cases since the early 70s. Here in Denver, we can see the transition pretty quickly because it's so clean in the mountains and then it hits Denver.
But the most dramatic change in the water comes after it leaves the metro area, when the South Platte heads east to the farmlands of the Great Plains. There we see the first buildup of nitrogen and phosphorus. Keeping the South Platte clean has been the key to Denver's development. Tens of thousands of people move to the metro area every year. And water technician Chris Ray knows that they all need clean water.
It is really the story of the West. Without the water that exists here, both in the mountains and in Denver, you wouldn't have the development that we have.
But Ray also knows that people further east, where he grew up, are counting on clean water from the West. And in the agricultural belt, the water will face its biggest challenge.
This is Nebraska, where the Platte River drives east through ranch country and sandy soils to the western edge of the Corn Belt. But most of the water here is not on the surface. It's deep underground. Nebraska sits atop the deepest part of the largest supply of fresh water in the nation, the High Plains Aquifer. The Platte River flows from Denver over the heart of the aquifer and actually helps replenish the groundwater that becomes a main source for drinking and irrigated agriculture. In fact, Nebraska has more farm acres under irrigation than any other state in the country. It's one of the top states in corn production. Over the years, farmers have applied phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer to their fields in force. So much, in fact, that it's contaminating parts of the aquifer they depend on, making the water unsafe to drink. One city in Nebraska is seeing that firsthand and working with farmers to keep the problem from getting any worse. Planting is underway for Bill McLeod on his farm in central Nebraska. He's been raising corn and soybeans here his whole life. Back when he started, McLeod says farmers thought differently about the best way to use nitrogen fertilizer to make their crops grow.
Everybody kind of understood that a little was good, a lot might be better.
You could always put on more, but in the soil, nitrogen fertilizer turns into nitrates that can leach into the groundwater. And in high doses, nitrates are dangerous for health, especially for young children and pregnant women. Unfortunately, decades of old farming habits have left a troubling legacy. In this area, the subsoil is loaded with nitrates from fertilizer, and there's no place for them to go but down, into the aquifer. Here's what's happening. Farmers put nitrogen fertilizer on their fields. In the soil, bacteria convert it into nitrates that are taken up by roots to feed plant growth. But when there are too many nitrates, water from rain or irrigation carries the extra nutrients past the point where roots can reach, and eventually to the aquifer below. The aquifer is moving like a slow river. When the nitrates fall into the groundwater, they move too, and they build up. Here in the High Plains Aquifer and others, there are pockets of nitrates pushing far past the legal limit of 10 parts per million. In central Nebraska, a pocket of high nitrate water is flowing right toward the wells where the city of Hastings draws its drinking water. It's a looming problem for the city's residents and for Marty Stengy, the environmental supervisor for Hastings Utilities System.
5 times the drinking water standard. So those are some really areas of high concern for us.
Stengy and his team are building a unique line of defense.
Basically, we're going to catch the nitrates coming into the municipal wells.
They'll use strategically placed wells like this one to act almost like a filter for the aquifer, skimming off nitrates as they move toward the city. Stange knows that nitrates tend to collect on the top of the aquifer, so unlike most wells, this one pumps from the top, middle, and bottom all at once. So the top water, the highest nitrates, it'll go off and be treated.
And then that clean water that's retrieved from that treatment process then will be mixed with this bottom water.
And go back underground.
And it'll go back underground. But you have to pump them all at the same time to make it work.
Clean water will be pumped back down into the aquifer, so the high nitrates never reach the wells that supply Hastings residents. High nitrate water left over from the cleanup will be sent to a storage lagoon and used to irrigate and fertilize this field. Nitrates that would be harmful to humans can be safely absorbed by this alfalfa.
So as the plants are growing, they will consume up those nitrates. So we're going to take lemons and make lemonade.
Stange says Hastings will spend $46 million to complete the system, a lot for a city of just 25,000 people. And if the problem gets worse, they'll have to spend a lot more for a full-scale nitrate removal plant.
It's not cheap for large communities either, certainly, but it's often difficult for small communities to put in adequate treatment.
Karen Flournoy says pollution from nutrients like nitrates is a nationwide problem, causing blooms of toxic algae from Florida to the Chesapeake Bay to Ohio.
It clearly is a national problem. Now, the sources may be a little bit different in other parts of the country. They might have a much higher mix of urban stormwater than we do here, but it's still a significant issue.
In Iowa, rainstorms flush nitrates off of farm fields into the Raccoon River, the water source for the state's capital, Des Moines. To provide safe water, the city runs a nitrate removal system. It ran for 177 days in 2015 at a cost of $7,000 per day. But engineering only provides short-term solutions. Back in Hastings, if the water is going to be safe long-term, farmers will have to make lasting changes. Farmer Bill McLeod already uses fertilizer differently today compared to when he started.
Nowadays, liquid fertilizer is not that cheap, and so we're trying to watch our pennies and just use what we need to out here.
Farmers are motivated by more than money. McLeod and others are being asked to do more, even if it's not by choice. Groundwater districts around Hastings have put additional rules in place to manage fertilizer use. McLeod says farmers have mixed feelings toward the rules.
We are doing it, because we care and everything, and that we're required to do it, too. And it's for future generations, it's just not us. My grandkids are going to be in this area, so they've got to live with the stuff that we're doing out here today. So that doesn't bother me quite so bad then to comply with some of these rules when you think about the future, I guess.
McLeod says farmers don't like the extra paperwork or restrictions on how they farm, but he says they do want clean water for their neighbors, their crops, and for their own homes. Keeping fertilizers and nitrates out of water is a tough challenge, but they aren't the only chemicals causing problems for water quality. Pesticides that fight off weeds, bugs, and fungi can move from farm fields, even lawns and golf courses, into streams and rivers. There are some chemicals you've probably heard of, like the weed killers atrazine and Roundup, and some you probably don't know, like trichlorphan, a common insecticide. Cities and government agencies test water for these chemicals, and the stakes are high. Just like nitrates, pesticides can be a danger to health and the environment. And researchers are working to understand what the risks are for fish and frogs and for humans.
In a trendy refurbished warehouse district, on a spring night, people gather at a creative space. But they aren't here for wine and sculpture. They're here to hear about frogs.
I'm going to tell you a story tonight I call From Silent Spring to Silent Night, A Tale of Toads and Men.
Few biologists have a story like Tyrone Hayes.
The largest chemical company in the world, Novartis, asked us to test their #1 selling product, atrazine. I never heard of it.
That was 1997, and Dr. Hayes quickly began learning about the world's best-selling pesticide. Using African clawed frogs in his research, he came to a controversial conclusion.
We found that atrazine had demasculinizing effects
on exposed males. So the voice box or the larynx didn't grow properly. Testosterone levels were really low. We eventually found out that sperm production was really low. We also found out that the exposed males could be feminized. They would grow ovaries or grow eggs.
It's easy to see why people come to listen to Hayes. He's engaging.
Ooh, I know what I'm not drinking tonight.
And funny. But he has one simple way of making the connection between his audience and his frogs.
So as they tell you what atrazine does to this frog's hormones, you should be thinking about what it does to me, to humans.
Atrazine is now the second most widely used pesticide in the U.S. And the EPA has recently drafted a report citing atrazine as a chronic risk, not just for frogs, but mammals, birds, and other wildlife, even when used according to labels. Chemical companies and agriculture associations refute the research, citing the chemical's role in increasing agricultural output and previous studies finding that atrazine is safe. For the University of Nebraska Omaha's Alan Kowak, the issue is far larger than a single chemical.
We have atrazine in the water in concert with a suite of other chemicals.
Sitting just a few miles north of where the Elkhorn meets the Platte, before it flows into the Missouri, Kowak's research station is perfectly placed.
Every time it rains, there's going to be surface runoff from both the towns and the agricultural areas. All of the water that runs off is, for all practical purposes, passing this point.
But it's not just the water he's interested in. It's the glop, the sediment that mixes with it and always has.
Many chemicals actually adhere to the sediment particles and move downstream associated with the sediment particles themselves. So it's not like we have to get rid of the nasty, ugly sediment to do our work. The sediment is our work.
Because spring rains raise the Elkhorn's levels dramatically, grad student Jonathan Ali has the not-so-enviable task of hauling buckets of water back to the lab to recreate field conditions without nature's complications. What they've seen so far in minnows echoes what Tyrone Hayes was finding with frogs, though with a small twist.
We see that females exposed are defeminized. So they produce less of the egg yolk protein that they need to produce healthy eggs.
You may be thinking, well, who cares about the little fish? On a molecular level, it's not that different.
Because the genetic structures of fish and humans are strikingly similar, and the chemical cocktail spilling into our waterways spikes during the growing season, so does Kowak's concern for expectant mothers.
If I had a daughter that was pregnant and it was in the spring, I would encourage my daughter to drink filtered water. It's just the cost relative to the potential adverse impacts, the cost is minimal. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Omaha drinking water. I'm just saying, why take that risk?
That risk is what agencies like the EPA are studying. Meanwhile, the Elkhorn River keeps on flowing, transporting whatever glop it picks up along the way.
We are all in this together. The days of thinking what happens in my backyard or what happens on my ranch is my business and it doesn't really affect anyone else. It's just not true.
We know that too much fertilizer or pesticide can leave the field, moving into groundwater or streams, sometimes at dangerous levels to humans. Previous generations of farmers may not have considered how excess nitrogen can impact water quality. According to the EPA, farms contribute more than 70% of the nutrients causing the Gulf dead zone. But today, many people are working on ways to reduce that pollution. In this next story, we visit some farms in Nebraska and Iowa using new and old technology to keep their crops profitable and the water clean.
When University of Nebraska professor Richard Ferguson looks at a cornfield, he has no illusions.
To profitably produce corn in Nebraska, we have to apply nitrogen fertilizer. In many cases, in the past, we applied more than we really needed.
Ferguson wants to reduce the chance that excess nitrogen will get into the groundwater. His high-tech approach, called Project Sense, uses sensor technology to help farmers fertilize during the growing season, as timely and precisely as possible.
If we can make them more money by the use of the sensor technology, we think that's something they would adopt.
Project Sense is being put to the test in areas where groundwater nitrate levels are high. Today, it's at the Syme family farm in central Nebraska. The machine's arms have sensors that gauge how much nitrogen the plants need. A computer fires applicators to deliver fertilizer, practically feeding plants one by one. For Anthony Syme, Sense is another tool for his family to try.
I don't think there's any farmer that wakes up in the morning and says, I'm just going to go dump 1,000 gallons of fertilizer down the ditch. Everybody's trying. It's just that it doesn't always work. There's a lot of things that we can't control, weather being the biggest one.
Anthony and his brothers have adopted their father's ideology of progressive farming. Like many farmers, Ken Syme used to put nearly all his fertilizer on the ground before the crops were even planted.
Today we apply everything in, we call it spoon feeding, which is a term for just a little bit at a time.
Noah Syme shows off one method of spoon feeding. It's called chemigation or fertigation. It uses a center pivot hooked up to a fertilizer tank. This lets the Symes control how much nitrogen gets applied each time they water. It's less precise, but less expensive than Project Sense, but still allows farmers to vary fertilizer rates in response to weather, soil moisture, and plant growth. Across the Missouri River in Iowa, you won't find many center pivots. Here, they rely on good soil and rain.
We got a 3-inch rain 24 hours ago or 48 hours ago, but you can see how the water didn't come down and leave a channel through my field. A lot of soil conservation is about slowing water down.
Dick Sloan farms in eastern Iowa near Cedar Rapids. Here, systems of underground pipe, or tiles, drain excess water off fields. But those tiles also carry fertilizer and pesticides and drain directly into nearby streams and rivers. This kind of field runoff isn't regulated, and Iowa has some of the worst water pollution in the Midwest. Sloan uses no-till and cover crops to help slow and filter water before it gets to his tiles.
You can see how everything's kind of knitted together.
He also devotes some of his land to prairie strips, land that could be used to grow corn or soybeans.
As water moves down across the field, it encounters this contoured strip that stop any residue from getting through there and have less water getting polluted as it goes down to the Cedar River and then on down to the Mississippi and down to the Gulf. So that's the hope.
Former Iowa Extension agent Chad Ingalls has worked with farmers like Dick Sloan on field practices to improve water quality in northeast Iowa. One new tool is something you can't see. It's called a bioreactor.
The water from this field would normally dump right out into this ditch behind us, but we have it go through this structure, and there's a set of gates on the inside that diverts it into the bioreactor that's underneath this grassy area. And the bioreactor is just a trench that's 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, and it's filled with wood chips.
As the nitrate-laden water passes through the wood chips, microbes turn the nitrates into harmless nitrogen gas, which makes up most of our atmosphere.
I think almost every field needs some kind of practice, whether it's a bioreactor, no-till, just better nitrogen and phosphorus management.
Craig Cox with the Environmental Working Group in Ames, Iowa, agrees that every field needs some sort of management. But he says voluntary measures don't work.
Otherwise, the water would be in a lot better shape than it is.
In the last decade, the federal government has spent more than $3 billion to support measures that reduce water pollution from Iowa farms. The Environmental Working Group monitored the use of 2 conservation practices over a 5-year period and found the net gain was negligible.
Here's the good news story. We got a new buffer, but here's the bad news story, right? We had a buffer, now we don't have one anymore.
Cox says some standard conservation practices should be required of all farmers. But Dick Sloan says his field practices can't be mandated on his neighbors.
People have a natural negative reaction to regulation. Anybody would. It's not just farmers are just so much like everybody else. It's going to take time for them to question what they're doing.
Farmers are very independent, but the reality is if we won't be stewards ourselves, someone will have to help us be a steward.
This is a solvable problem. It's just everyone has to do their part.
One thing I always tell people when I work with them, if you can make me better at what I'm doing, I'm in.
From farmers building bioreactors and planting cover crops to the U.S. Geological Survey monitoring the water across the nation, there are plenty of people watching our water. What's clear is that water quality is an issue both close to home and far downstream, from the leftover chemicals in urban wastewater to the fertilizer and pesticides from farm fields across the Mississippi River Basin.
Those chemicals and the sediment will wind up in the Atchafalaya Basin, in the Gulf of Mexico. So it just kind of shows that we need to kind of broaden our overall geographic scope, how we think about chemicals and how they move around.
Just like in Hastings, Nebraska, and in Iowa, our pathway to cleaner water is going to rely on a combination of innovation and conservation.
We have to think a little bit more than just yield today. We need to think about the health of the farm. We need to think about the viability of our ag community, because certainly Hastings is tied to that as well.
In the end, having plentiful water isn't good enough if it's not safe for people or the environment. Historically, clean water was key to successful development in the U.S., and nothing has really changed. Our future still relies on clean water for everyone.